Is it going? Yes. Okay. So for those of you who are looking for a nice, boring discussion, keep moving, because we get to talk about one of the most contentious and complicated topics today, which is, what is Israel? What is Israel? Right? If I say Israel,
is it a country? Is it a people?
So the first question is, are we talking about Bnei Israel, right? The children of Israel, which refers to the Jewish people as a whole, or are we talking about Eretz Israel, the land of Israel? Today we're going to make it easy. We're only going to be talking about the Eretz, only about Eretz Israel, only about the land of Israel. All right, so if I ask you to find Israel on a map, hard? Easy? I hope it's easy, right? Right, because right now we've got a lovely little country that can be found on any map. Well, almost any map.
Almost any map, yes.
Sorry, any map made by someone who is an honest cartographer that looks something like that. Pardon my rough sketching. And there'll be, a little flag somewhere on it, with it's supposed to be a star. And you may or may not have some additional dotted lines and things, calling disputed or all that. But basically, the overall shape of Israel on the map and on most maps is not too hard to find. Why is that Israel? Why is that Israel? And is that Eretz Israel? Is that the land of Israel? What a weird question. How could this not be Eretz Israel?
I thought it was the land that God promised to Moses. He said, get up and go to a land that I will show you. That's
So-
Abraham also.
Is Eilat Eretz Israel?
Oh, okay.
Right?
You wonder.
Is the tip of Gaza Eretz Israel? What about the northern tip of the Golan? Is that the land that God told Moses? Is that the land that God promised to Abraham? Right. I'm not trying to change the political boundaries of the modern state of Israel.
These are political boundaries, exactly right. And there are other kinds of boundaries.
Okay.
Like
So,
when Abraham walked the land, that was to set up the boundaries in the first place.
well, so what are the boundaries of Eretz Israel? Dun, dun, dun.
On that map, where would Samaria be?
Well, what's Judah and Samaria, what's usually referred to in English print as the West Bank, is this area sort of right about like that. And then you have,
That's where your dots were.
yeah, again, not drawn to scale, because Gaza isn't that big in comparison, but I'm freehanding this, I apologize. That's the area that would normally be called Judah and Samaria, or the West Bank. And when we talk about the land of Israel politically, it's actually quite clear. We have mostly internationally recognized borders with some disputed areas that are still being discussed. Okay. And there are lots of people who are going to continue those discussions, I'm sure, for a long time. But this is the Torah class, so we want to talk about what does Torah or what does Judaism biblically or rabbinically say is the land of Israel. Because it may surprise you to know the Torah is not 100% clear in a way that is easily understood by a modern reader. That caveat's important about what it's actually discussing when it says Eretz Israel. And it's not 100% consistent from our perspective of what it means, because it seems to be described in a couple different ways, some very different than others. So that's what we need to get into, but we need to see at least one discussion on page 981 as we begin Devarim. This is chapter 1, book of Deuteronomy. And we're going to start right up from the beginning because Moses is giving us a summary. Reminder, Deuteronomy is the book that was composed on the edge of the Jordan River over here. Where Moses is sort of giving his summation of everything. He knows that he's not going across the water. He's not going to go across the Jordan into the land of Israel. First clue. And that he wants to sum up, how did we get here? What was our journey? Later he goes into what are some of the commandments, and then he does some final hooray and warnings and that's the book of Deuteronomy. So it's mostly all Moses' speech, broken into a few parts. So let's start at the beginning.
These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan, through the wilderness in the Arabah near Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Nichamad. It is 11 days from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir route.
Got it. So we're all very clear where we are, right? All right. So basically what it's trying to say is we know that Horeb, which is the other name for Mount Sinai, is somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula. That's fairly clear. Exactly where, we're not 100% sure. And we know that it's a journey from there to some place called Kadesh Barnea, which is sort of at the edge-ish of the modern state of Israel, or perhaps across the border, we'll see. And then there is an additional trek to where they are now. So that's what's being described, right? Horeb, Kadesh Barnea, and then we're on the opposite side of the Jordan. Make sense? Ish.
Ish.
Ish. Well, and it is ish. Now, if you were living 3,000 years ago and you were familiar with the trade routes and the geography of your region, this would be no different than saying, you know, you got to go up to Gainesville, and then from Gainesville you're going to go down this way. It would make perfect sense. You know, from Gainesville to Orlando, it's, you know, a 2.5, 3 hour drive. It's 11 days walk. It's probably,
Yes.
especially in the summer. Okay,
But
so
if I gave it the names that the American Indians had called it 300 years ago,
it would confuse you to no
we
end.
have no idea.
Exactly. Or and naming is a very important issue. And thank you for raising it early. You know, the same way that you might talk, I remember very clearly when I moved to Baltimore, people would give directions along the lines of, well, you're going to go down the road and you're going to go past the shopping center that used to be pink. I wasn't here when it was pink. So calling it used to be pink is a kind of useless description to someone new, but it means everything to somebody who's a local. So the names can change. And we're going to see we have a big issue on some of the names when we get through this.
It was in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, that Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given him for them. After he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelled in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth and Edrei, on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching. He said,
all right, so we know we're over here. We're in the land of Moab. Remember, Moab is one of the descendants from Lot's families, or from one of his daughters. So that's where we are, and we've done all the work needed to get to this point.
right, we're up to the 40th year now. This is 40 years.
And we know what happens after the 40 years is it's time to go in. So a little recapitulation.
So the Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, which would be Sinai.
Yes, right, this is Moses himself speaking.
You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arabah, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, the sea coast, the land of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I placed the land at your disposal. Go, take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to them and to their heirs after them.
Okay, so where's the land we're going to? We just got multiple descriptions. Anything surprise you? Any landmarks that seemed, well, not on our map? How about the Euphrates? Anybody remember the Euphrates being part of the land of Israel? When you went on your Bible tour, when you were visiting Israel, everybody here has visited Israel at some point?
Yeah.
Did they take you to visit the
I
Euphrates?
don't recall seeing the Euphrates.
No,
No.
because the nearest place you could find the Euphrates is up here in Syria,
Oh,
right? Or if you want to go vertically, you can visit the Euphrates over here in Iraq, right? The Euphrates and the Tigris and Euphrates go right through the middle of Mesopotamia. They begin up in Syria. So is Israel short a few hundred miles?
yeah.
That's odd. Okay. And Lebanon? The Lebanon? Does that mean the modern state of Lebanon? Or does it mean a region that was known as Lebanon in biblical Hebrew that may or may not be exactly the borders of the modern state. Hint, it's the latter. It'd be like saying the Rockies. Even if there was a town known as, Rocky Town, that doesn't mean that's the town that's being described. It's a region being described by this term. And then this modern state took its name from that ancient regional name. It didn't take its borders from the ancient name. Maybe makes sense? Okay, let's dive into what other descriptions we got, because we can tell right off the bat here for most of us, this is not going to let us sit down with Google Maps and draw Israel. These descriptions are not clear enough in and of themselves. So maybe we can get some more. We got maps on the back. We'll be there in a second. But everybody loves maps. Okay, so on the top page, we have to start off with, first of all, by reminding ourselves why this is important fundamentally. So a quote from Mishnah Kelim.
The land of Israel is holier than all other lands.
So it kind of matters knowing which land is Israel, right? Because if this land is holier than this land, I sort of need to know where the border is. And we're going to come back later on to find out some of the other issues that are important, give or take, whether you're standing in Israel or standing not in Israel. Okay, so here is a maximalist position of what Israel might be.
Cyprus belongs to Israel.
But Cyprus is where on the map? The island over here in the Mediterranean.
That's where the British.
Yeah, right.
Yes, it was used by the British.
As a holding.
Exactly, because it was a convenient spot for them to catch people and hold them in until they figured out what they wanted to do. So
Cyprus belongs to Israel and was called the island of Dan. The borders of Israel stretch from the Nile River,
which is way down here in Egypt,
to the Euphrates,
which is way up here, again, not drawn to scale, in Syria.
Eastern Egypt, Sinai, Jordan, part of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, part of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and part of Turkey are all within the biblical borders of Israel. They are so-called occupied territory.
Okay. If you look on the back page, we're going to start up with the top map here. You can see the Nile and the Euphrates have been made darker. Yes? So what is being advocated here is that if you were to take the top of the Euphrates, the dark line, and just go straight west, just draw a line straight across through where it says Hittites. That's southern Turkey there, right? You just draw a line straight across. And if you draw a line from the Nile going straight up, then you create a little box right there. And that covers Cyprus, a huge chunk of Syria, a large chunk of southern Turkey, Lebanon, obviously. And if you take the Euphrates, and what Rabbi Schneerson is doing here is saying, take the Euphrates not where they stop here, but all the way down to the Gulf of Persia, right? So that's that line going all the way down to the bottom of the map, and then come all the way across to meet the Nile. That is Eretz Israel. A lot of territory. Well, he lists what the modern states are. That you are taking up Syria, a big chunk of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, a large portion of Egypt, Cyprus, and southern Turkey. Impressive. And where in the world does he get that idea from?
Right there, it's pretty much what it said, what we just read.
Well, it says the river Euphrates. Did it say Nile?
No, I didn't say that.
Did it say which part of the river Euphrates? Right. If I were to say, I want you to go down to the I-4. Does that mean the I-4 in Daytona? Does that mean the I-4 in Tampa? Does that mean the I-4 that's closest to where we currently are? We might have a shared understanding, but if someone 200 years later came and was reading something that didn't know where we were standing when it was said, and didn't know if I was also pointing in a particular way, or had other context around it, and just said I-4, they might be very confused of which part of the I-4 I might be referring to. let's take a look at where this most maximal description might be based on from Torah. And that goes all the way back to Genesis, the first time the land of Israel as an inheritance is being mentioned to Abraham. Let's see how God describes it.
To your descendants, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates.
Right, you can tell Euphrates always gets that little title, Great River.
When he says the river of Egypt, are we talking about the Nile, perhaps?
I don't know.
We don't know.
We're going to find out.
All right, Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
All right, so that's it. So from some river in Egypt to Euphrates, somehow, these nations live in that area, and that land's now yours.
Wow.
All right? There are 10 nations here, but we don't know where they all are. We know some of them. The Jebusites we know were definitely associated with Jerusalem. The Canaanites we know were definitely associated with the area that is most commonly the middle section here of the modern state of Israel. The Hittites, at least by archaeology, we know controlled a vast empire that extended all the way up into Turkey and all the way through Syria and areas of Iraq. It was an enormous empire at the time. So, and all the way down into up against Israel itself. It was Hittite in the story of Lot when he gets kidnapped by the invading kings. They weren't invading kings; those were the Hittite kings that were ruling this area's city-states by proxy. And when they stopped paying taxes, they came back to knock heads. So when you say Hittite, do you mean the extent of the Hittite Empire, or do you mean the extent closest to the area that we're mostly talking about that happened to be ruled by the Hittites? Anyone scratching their head yet?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. And as we're going to come back to again, as I said, knowing where Israel exists matters. More than just the modern political issue, which matters greatly, obviously, but it has mattered even when we have not been in control of the territory, even when we were not the government. We still needed to know where Israel was because Israel has special status in the eyes of Judaism that other lands don't, even when we're not always in control. Okay, so let's see what some of our commentators do with what we just got as a promise to Abraham.
It seems that these were nations in the days of Abraham, and they were wiped out before the days of Moses and Joshua, similar to how the Rephaim were gone before Moses.
Right. So if you are familiar with the stories of later from Moses and then the stories of Joshua and the Judges, you will find that these guys, there are a lot of them that don't show up in those stories. It's almost as though, as Shadal points out, they had been nations or cultures or groups during the days of Abraham, but come 300, 400, 500 years later, they weren't around anymore. And so by the time Moses sets up his shop on the other side of the Jordan, he doesn't need to mention them because they're not there. And the Torah even specifically mentions the Rephaim having been sort of gone before Moses shows up on the scene. And Shadal is arguing that the others probably had disappeared too. So what do we do with their territory? The territory of the guys who aren't even there at the time Moses shows up. How is Moses supposed to know what land that is? Right? So it's this is the mall. This is the mall that used to be pink.
Yeah.
Right? You get to conquer the territory that used to belong to these guys, but there's no one around here who are them. Well, and what if they had shrunk during the intervening time? What if they had expanded their empire during the intervening time? Does that mean the promise that God gave to Abraham shrinks or expands depending upon the successes of the military of these other nations between when Abraham left and when we returned? Yeah, give me some actual borders.
Yeah, right.
Yes, keep going.
Even if those borders may look to you like it's a very large area, it's only large compared to the teeny Israel that we have now. But now you're leading me to believe that the holiness of the land might be as big as, for instance, France. I mean, nobody complains the French don't have too much land. It might be much larger, but that land.
Well, the Germans actually have historically complained about that.
Oh,
But
yes, that's true. I mean, I didn't realize, because this is a holy land, but it might be even holier than what we know now, so.
Well, it's not going to be holier than we know, but it might be larger
It
than
might
we
be
know.
larger, the holy areas maybe.
The holiness doesn't go
further-
up and down.
Further out, right.
But it may also come further in, as we're going to see. Right now, we're dealing with the more maximalist statements. But
Okay.
first of all, we're going to walk one back with
Ibn
Ibn Ezra.
Ibn Ezra explains, this is the Nahal of Egypt, and it is not the Nile.
Okay, so if you look on the back page, and you look the bottom left picture here, see where it says River of Egypt?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Right? So there is what's known as a wadi, a seasonal river, an area that exists down there. It's just south of where Gaza is today. That is well known in antiquity as being a landmark. And the idea here is that when it's talking about this Nahal, that it's not talking about the river of Egypt that most of us would automatically leap to when we hear a capital T and a capital N, capital T and a capital R. The N was some Nahal, sorry. But instead was this, which was much more known to the local people, right? The average person would never see the Nile, but the average person might very well know people who go back and forth across the Nahal Mitzrayim all the time on their big journeys. So that may shorten considerably. For example, if we do that on our big map, we're now not going to get all of Cyprus if we draw our line, right? To get all of Cyprus, you've got to believe that it meant Nile. And most of our historical commentators, most of the people who studied Torah and left their commentaries, do not believe that Nahal Mitzrayim was referring to the Nile. They believe it was referring to a tributary or a river on the edge of what is now the modern state of Israel. Not that far. So I'm afraid we're going to have to scale back area. We're definitely not going that far south, at least according to most commentators. But again, it is a little ambiguous. We are trying to understand something without the benefit of a living guide that can point out the landmarks in ways we recognize. But that does seem to be more agreed upon than not.
The promise to Abraham is that if a Davidic king would choose to conquer all the way out to the Euphrates, the land would then have the legal status of Israel.
All right, so Seforno is also confused about this by this description in Bereshit, in Genesis, because it makes the land seem enormous. Yeah. And we know from the descriptions in the books of Kings that it didn't really ever get that enormous. So why didn't, when Joshua was doing the conquest, why didn't they conquer out that far? Why in all of the descriptions in the books of Kings, although they occasionally engaged in wars that went in some of those directions, it doesn't seem like it was the primary goal. And we know that settling and holding the land of Israel is kind of a big deal in Judaism. So if they had believed that that land way out there in this area was what God wanted us to have as Israel, then we would have been marching on it constantly in order to secure it. And we didn't. So Sforno tries to compromise by saying, well, we could have gone up to the Euphrates and that would have added it to the nation of Israel, and it would have had the same legal status, but that was extra credit. And so you didn't have to do that, and therefore by not doing it, we haven't failed in the commandment of settling the land. Following the logic? Right? So because he's trying to reconcile this really weird incongruity, which is that the Israel of the ancient world was a lot smaller than the promise that God gave Abraham. And the people seemed okay with that. And so why were they okay if they were supposed to settle the entire thing? Because we know that they worked very, very hard and tirelessly to settle the land under Joshua and then to defend it under the judges, and then even more so under David and Solomon. And they were working mostly in a land that was quite similar to what we were describing in the modern world. They were not going as far afield as southern Turkey and northern Syria and Saudi Arabia and down into the Nile. Well, Sforno says that must have been because that stuff was just optional. Just optional. Maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Because they didn't have the resources or the people, the numbers to settle that much land.
Okay, but the question is then, is Seforno right that we didn't have the resources to do it, but it remained Eretz Israel in perpetuity? Or it could have become Eretz Israel, but it didn't, so it isn't. Right? Because it makes a difference. Right? For example, if you all know that when we are in the diaspora, we celebrate holidays for 2 days rather than 1. If I am in Damascus, not right now, thank you. If I am in Damascus for Sukkot, how many days do I celebrate? 1 or 2?
Yes.
Everybody would say 2. If it was Eretz Israel, it would be 1. So I'm making a statement by by celebrating 2 days that this land is not Eretz Israel. But if it is Eretz Israel, then I definitely should not be celebrating 2 days. I should only be celebrating 1.
So when there were Jews in Damascus,
Mm-hmm.
how many days did they celebrate? They did
Sure.
so they considered
Yeah.
themselves in the diaspora.
And there's another issue that comes from this maximalist position. Where did Abraham start? Haran, right? Well, before Haran even, he came from Ur, right? Which is, let me get our map, right? So Ur is way down here in the southern tip of Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates start to come together.
I thought Ur was in Turkey.
No, not by most explanations that I've read. And they came up from there into either northern Iraq or Syria into Haran. And then what did God tell him to do there?
Go to Canaan.
Because,
That's your land that I promised you.
but if Haran is here and the land has been promised there, isn't he already in it? Right? And wasn't he promised a land not of your ancestors, not of your father's land? But if his father's living here, then that means it can't be part of his land. So this Euphrates mention would have covered Abraham already before he had to lech lecha, before he had to go to the land of Israel. So it's really confusing. Was God saying that that land that he had just left would be included and that he had never really left? Or was it saying it was Euphrates' word? That is to say, it goes in the direction of the Euphrates, but not actually up to the Euphrates. All right, let's take a look at the next text that tries to help make sense of this. All right, so now we're looking at from Numbers, just from last week, which is going to give us more detail. Yay, detail.
I need more names. When you enter Canaan, the land that will be allotted to you as an inheritance is to have these boundaries.
Yay.
Your southern side will include some of the desert of Zin along the border of Edom. Your southern boundary will start in the east from the southern end of the Dead Sea, cross south of Scorpion Pass, continue on to Zin, and go south of Kadesh Barnea.
All right, so basically what's being described here is something along that line. If you look here on the back map, you'll see there's one from Numbers and one from Ezekiel. The lighter colored one is the one that Numbers is describing, right? So it goes roughly across the southern swoop. But as you would see, all of the southern tip of the Negev, the modern state of Israel's southern tip, is not in that border. Keep going.
Then it will go to Hazar Adad and over to Asmon, where it will turn, join the Wadi of Egypt, and end at the Mediterranean Sea.
All right, that's that little loop up at the bottom there. All right, that's the turning that is being described.
Your western boundary will be the coast of the Mediterranean Sea.
That's the one thing everybody agrees on. It's so helpful. Everybody knows. I mean, I couldn't even imagine if we were, in the middle of Iraq, where there's no water boundaries at all. It's just all dirt. Okay, we all agree.
This will be your boundary on the west. For your northern boundary, run a line from the Mediterranean Sea to Mount Hor, and from Mount Hor to Lebo Hamath. Then the boundary will go to Zedad, continue to Zifron, and end at Hazar Enan. This will be your boundary on the north.
All right, so if you look again on your back page, this interpretation, because these place names are not universally identified or agreed upon, goes with Mount Hor as being up here in Lebanon and going inland and then coming down a little ways like that. And you can see it's just missing Damascus. So it's taking a large chunk out of what is modern day Lebanon, but not so much out of Syria. However, as you also notice where it says Mount Hor in the Mediterranean, there's a little question mark.
Yes.
Because Mount Hor could be, if you look down here lower, where Mount Hermon is, which I'm sure more of you are familiar with. We're not sure what Mount Hor is the real Mount Hor. So it's either taking a big chunk of Lebanon or taking none at all, more or less. Keep going.
For your eastern boundary, run a line from Hazar Enan to Shephan. The boundary will go down from Shephan to Riblah on the east side of Ain and continue along the slopes east of the Sea of Galilee. Then,
Which is a large portion of what is modern day Golan.
Then the boundary will go down along the Jordan and end at the Dead Sea. This will be your land with its boundaries on every side.
Yay, Jordan River, that makes it a lot easier. Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, a lot easier. And so we end up with something that either has this bump at the top or basically goes from Mount Hermon down, including part of the Golan and that. What do we think? Clear?
Not so much.
All right, what can we say definitively? All right, so here's the test. I'm going to take out a pen. You tell me if what I'm coloring in is part of Israel or not, or maybe.
The test.
Okay? Here's how we go from what we just read. Yes, no, maybe.
Yeah. I think that looks good.
As a yes?
Sure.
What was the eastern boundary? The Jordan River.
Yeah.
Right, according to what we just read
Right.
in Numbers, right? That is a definite not part of Israel.
Oh, no. Oh.
Secondary evidence how we know that is not part of Eretz Israel. What was the story that we read about just last week involving Reuben and Gad and their cows?
Oh.
No, that's where they stay.
That's where they stayed. They had to ask special permission to stay on that side of the Jordan
Yes.
because it isn't part of the inheritance in the land of Israel that was supposed to be apportioned. They only had it because of the war when they'd been attacked and we had defended ourselves. And they had to give up their portion in the, in quote, real land that their brothers would inherit when they went across the Jordan. All right, so that's pretty clear, not there. The Nile River. What do we think? Yay or nay from what we just read?
Part of it?
As part of Israel? Is it part of Israel? Not part of Israel?
No.
Not. Definitely does not seem. Don't get any illusions about Israel on the Nile. Cooperating with Egypt on the Nile, that would be nice in the future, but not happening. Okay. Crete. Or sorry, Cyprus. Sorry, Crete's a little bit further over.
It says it belongs to, well, according to Rabbi Schneerson.
Yeah, according to the book of Numbers, which is, no offense, but is more important than Rabbi Schneerson.
Yeah.
No, Cyprus is not.
No.
No.
All right. So that's also a no. All right. Eilat.
No.
Does not seem to be, because the line is basically going from somewhere here around the Dead Sea down and up, but it does not seem to reach all the way down to Eilat by descriptions. Now, Eilat is going to be emotional because most of us consider that to be part of Israel, and hopefully you've all had a chance to visit there. But we're not talking about the political boundaries of Israel. This is not saying Israel should pull back to the description, the vague description of the biblical boundaries. This is asking where is Eretz Israel, which again is a legal category within halakha, within Jewish law. It is not a political category. Israel has ruled this area over here. We just read about it last week, and it happens off and on during the tribal period and king period. That didn't make it part of the land of Israel for all legal purposes. For some it did, but not for all. How do we know definitively even without the confusing terminology, which we may or may not be interpreting right, always the chance for error, how do we know definitively that Eilat could not be part of Eretz Israel? Who's not allowed to go to Israel? Famously. Which guy? Who's talking right now? Moses, right? How does Moses get here from Egypt without going through Eretz Israel? The only way it can work, exactly, is that if this is not part of Israel, then he can walk through there and he's fine. If this is part of Eretz Israel, he's already been there. If the Nile were part of Eretz Israel, he was born there. Right? So for Moses to have not been able to go to Israel, Israel has to be smaller than its current political boundaries. Otherwise, he already walked through it. The irony, of course, is that his descendants by 1,000 generations, well, maybe 50 generations, do have that as part of their homeland. But for Moses, it was not part of the original promise. And so he missed out. If he had been born later, he could have gone to vacation in Eilat and he would have had his Israeli passport and that would have been great. But at the time that he went through, the promise only covered a part of the Negev and he went through the other part. So close, so close. All right.
How many days do they celebrate Sukkot?
What's that?
How many days do they celebrate?
Okay. So in Israel itself, as we're going to talk about, because we're going to get to an even more controversial text in just a minute, in Israel itself, in the modern political state, people in all of these sections celebrate the holidays as one day. They are part of Medinat Israel, the state of Israel. It's under Jewish control and Jewish authority, and they use that as the foundation for one day. But Ezekiel gives a very similar thing, and I'm looking at my clock, we're going to skip Ezekiel.
Yes,
Ezekiel gives a very similar set of boundaries, and if you look on the back, you can see the interpretation of his description. It's very, very similar to Numbers, just different landmarks. But down the second paragraph from the end, from Gittin, we need to know where the land of Israel begins and ends, because how we relate to witnesses and a get that was written outside the land, that is being delivered into the land, depends upon whether the get was written outside of the land. So you need to know where the boundaries are so that you can properly analyze documents that are foreign in origin versus native in origin. Because the first thing you have to establish with the get is whether it is a reliable get, that it is a properly validated get. Because it may seem strange in the modern world, but in the ancient world, get forgery was a big problem. Absolutely. You've got some guy who's off on a business trip, which can take a year, traveling the high seas, or he lives in another town for whatever reason while his wife is back in some other town, and she would like to get divorced, or she wants to make a claim against his estate, or she has found some attractive man who she would like to marry. She cannot initiate the divorce on her own under Jewish law. So what do? Well, easy way to get around it is you have someone write a get and pretend that it's been sent by her husband, that it's being delivered from afar. And then she is free in the eyes of the locals, but of course she is still married in the eyes of Jewish law. And now we've got problems with adultery and all sorts of other issues. So before you even can write a get, you have to make sure you know what gets you can trust. That's why Gittin starts by saying the ones from inside Israel you can trust more implicitly than the gets that are written from outside Israel, which means we need to know in and out clearly. Here we go.
So Rabbi Judah says from Rechem eastward, Rechem being like the east, from Ashkelon southward, Ashkelon being like the south.
These are the parts that are outside.
And from Akko northwards, Akko being like the north. Rabbi Meir says Akko counts as the land of Israel in the matter of bills of divorce.
All right, so Rechem is not 100% clear. Didn't really draw this very clearly. We need the little hyphen bump. But he's saying Akko and Ashkelon. And Rechem, we're not 100% clear on. It's somewhere-ish in this vicinity. If you go north, east, or south of this, or I guess I should say south of this, you're outside Israel. right? If you go north of Akko, some including Akko, you're outside Israel. And if you go south of Ashkelon, including Ashkelon itself, you're outside Israel. Israel just got really small.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this then becomes the issue that we're going to sort of wrestle with till to the end, I'm sure, which is that the definition of Israel doesn't have a single clear measure that is used exactly the same in every single point, both in history or even within Jewish law. And this issue with Gittin, they're not trying to establish the political boundaries of the state of Israel. At the time that they're writing this, there is no political state of Israel. There are community institutions that are doing the best they can under Roman rule, but Romans undeniably are in control of the country. So there is no political state per se. So they want to establish the boundaries of trustworthy Israel, that they can check the information from the witnesses easily, and therefore it has a higher degree of confidence. They're not necessarily saying that isn't part of the promise of Abraham. They're just saying right now, this is as far as our influence reaches. Does that make sense, that distinction? Right? They're not trying to establish political boundaries. They're trying to establish a cultural boundary from their day and age. And that's why Ashkelon, which is quite far north, really, is considered, those Ashkelonians, you're not so sure about them.
The Ashkelon South.
Right. So Ashkelon South is out because most of the communities at this time that is being discussed here were in the north and some were in the sort of middle. There weren't a lot of Jewish communities in the far south. Hebron, but not so many. That was just the nature of the repercussions of the Roman destruction and occupation. So those guys way down there, we're not 100% sure. We're going to call that outside Israel as far as checking the gets when they come in. Goes on further to say, you know what, I only check the coastal cities. Or I don't check the coastal cities because people travel along that easily, but inland, there's not a lot of cross traffic, so that you'd have to be. So it's not cut and dry that they're giving boundaries the way we think of as boundaries. They are giving boundaries of saying, well, if I ask you, name the rabbis in Orlando, right? Am I an Orlando rabbi? Or am I not? Right? The Winter Springs is not part of Orlando as far as zip codes go.
Greater.
Greater Orlando. So where does Greater Orlando go to? The land?
Right.
Gainesville? Right? Tampa?
Yeah, right over.
Because absolutely, when the Federation is advocating on behalf of the Jews of the Greater Orlando area, what are their boundaries?
Built in the heritage, I'll tell you.
Well, somewhat, but I'm sure that there would be people who would dispute, does Mount Dora count as the Greater Orlando area or not? Why not? I mean, but Mount Dora is only one step further away from Orlando City Center than we are from Orlando City Center. So they don't have a freeway to get to it. But if you drove surface streets from downtown City Hall to here, I'm sure that it would take about the same amount of time as you drove surface streets from here to Mount Dora, especially with the traffic lights. So there's always been a flexible definition, a working definition of what is our zone. And that is separate from what is the political definition. But it's important because that working definition of what matters for us, as you can see in the bottom line here, matters for tithing. Land grown within the land of Israel has special tithing requirements compared to land outside, or fruit, or produce. The bringing of the first fruits and its accessibility has differences between in and out. The corners of the field that are left for the poor, that is a specific requirement in the land of Israel. It should be honored outside, but it's not required. The sabbatical and jubilee years, when you allow the land to lie fallow, rather major question of whether I can farm this year or not, all depends upon the borders of the land of Israel. Purity laws, every land outside of Israel is considered to be ritually impure from the get-go. So if you come from outside the land of Israel, you are considered ritually impure when you arrive in Israel, and you have to then take the proper steps for ritual purification. This is back in the days of the temple. Divorce law, as we already talked about. Settling the land. Am I required to settle Damascus as part of Judaism, or am I not required to settle Damascus as part of Judaism? Major issue. And of course, probably the most important, milchemet mitzvah, a war. I believe that most people here were here when we discussed the questions of what wars in Israel are considered optional and what wars are considered to be obligatory. And one of the obligatory wars, milchemet mitzvah, is self-defense. That every Jew, even those who are normally exempted from other forms of fighting, have to defend the land of Israel itself were it to be attacked. So if the king says, I want to go invade Greece, which everybody agrees is not part of Israel, the people who have just gotten married, who have just planted a vineyard, who have just built a house, the cowards, they can say, not it, I'm not going. If someone lands ships in Jaffa Harbor and starts putting troops on the shore, you don't get to say, not it. Everyone is obliged to fight. As the halacha says, you can take the groom from the chuppah and drag him to the front lines.
Okay, that was in ancient times. Today, God forbid, what would happen with those students that
That's a more complicated political issue, and in fact, that is one of the ongoing debates within Jewish society. There are, and I'm trying to decide how political I want to go on this. So there are two schools of thought about the current status of Israel and its army in the land of Israel right now. There are those who believe that the IDF are waging a slow but constant milchemet mitzvah, that it is a war of self-defense that is ongoing, and although there may be lulls in the fighting, where you don't have the massive armies attacking, you have constant aggression from both state actors around Israel, as well as the non-state actors and terrorist organizations and other groups. And people who hold to that view believe that compulsory military service and sharing the burden is absolutely required of everybody, from the greatest scholar in yeshiva down to the guy who just got married and hasn't even had his honeymoon. That everybody needs to serve. And we can share that balance, we can balance that share of duty as we can, given the lulls, but everybody should be ready to fight and trained to fight, meaning everyone should serve. There is a contingent, however, within the ultra-Orthodox world, the Haredim, who say no, that Israel is not at a state of war, that if it were at a state of war, they would fight, but since it's not, you can't stop them from studying instead of serving in the IDF. I obviously agree more with the first side than the other. I wish we were in a state of peace where Israel's security needs were no different than border patrol and policing. But anybody who watches what happens in Israel knows that this is more than just the normal peacekeeping that happens in a country that is not at war. It's not as hot as it has been in the past, and for that I'm very thankful, but it is still in a steady, slow burn of war. And I believe everybody who can should serve. So, did I answer your question?
yes.
Okay. So knowing how much of the land is the land is very, very important for many, many things. And knowing that it's not a simple slam dunk answer of what those borders are is also very, very important. There will continue to be, I am sure, many, many discussions in the coming years of questions of land for peace, of withdrawal, of re-engagement, of where borders should be drawn. It is not an easy question to answer. It's not an easy question to answer just what was given as our inheritance in the first place. As we can see, some people say it's enormous, and others at different times have said it's very, very minor. What is important is having good and clear discussions about how best to defend the land of Israel, how best to protect the borders that it has in whatever shape and configuration they might be, and how to make sure that Israel continues to exist in order that we can do the mitzvahs in it that have been given to us by Torah. And there's no one-word answer for that. There's no slogan for that. There's no simple pen and map to say definitively this yes, this no. It is a complicated and difficult process, but one that we would be well to think deeply about and discuss with each other in order that we can pursue the best for our brothers and sisters in Israel and by extension for ourselves. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Israel just won a bronze, I saw, in
Oh, they did?
judo. They got a bronze.
Oh,
Okay, you said something.
They didn't play against